Well, hello everybody, welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. My friends, there's been a lot of mediocre argumentation surrounding Elon Musk's recent acquisition of Twitter for $44 billion, billion with a B. And as a student of philosophy and someone who wants to see our political discourse become smarter and better and wants to see the soul of the American founders reflected in the discourse, because we understand at Constitution Hall, the founders were not posting memes, the founders were not shutting down debate, they were fighting, sometimes viciously so, at each other's throats to craft the framework for what will become our flourishing, fundamentally moral republic. And I want to see that kind of conversation reflected in the American ethos. But unfortunately, a lot of people who are critiquing Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter do not care about that same level of political conversation, and their arguments suffer for it. So I intend to go through at least 6 arguments here that leftists have typically put against Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. I intend to do so in short order. If I need to do so, I will come back later in a different video and expand upon them, just so I can show you guys the basis or the lack of basis for some of these critiques. There are good arguments to be made on many things, but on some things, you ought to just make the correct argument and not simply argue from your ideology. If your ideology does not have the correct argument, you ought to check your premises and see if your ideology is leading you astray or not. Let us begin. The first contention we have against Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter comes from Senator Elizabeth Warren, and she basically says, and I'm going to summarize her argument and then quote it exactly, that Elon's purchase of Twitter justifies the wealth tax and that his purchase is dangerous for democracy. She said exactly, this is her tweet, billionaires like Elon Musk play by a different set of rules than everyone else, accumulating power for their own gain. We need a wealth tax and strong rules to hold big tech accountable. Well, there's a few things going on. She also said that, again, Elon Musk purchasing it is dangerous for democracy. So there's a few things wrong with her statement. Number one, proximity ethics. Elizabeth Warren is more concerned about Musk's wealth as opposed to the content of his purchase. The fact that he purchased Twitter is incidental to his wealth. Yes, he needs wealth to purchase Twitter, but the fact that he bought Twitter with money says nothing about what he intends to do with Twitter, which is the substantial point that critics of Musk should look at him upon. The fact that he has money in and of itself is not a sin. And the fact that Elizabeth Warren treats it as a sin means that she sees wealth itself, accumulated masses of wealth itself, as something worthy of condemnation, which it is not if it is accrued legitimately, which one could argue Musk's wealth is most certainly accrued legitimately, as he has invented a lot of things that is potentially going to take humanity to the stratosphere. So what the proximity ethics comes in is when you look at anything in the world and you say, this person is close to this one thing, therefore this person is condemned. I like to use this example. Let's say there's a fire going on in a house and I am near the fire with a gasoline can. You immediately assume, because I have a gasoline can, that I started the fire, even though I could have been filling up my car. That's proximity ethics, looking at the appearance of something, not peering beyond the surface, and making an indictment on the basis of the appearance of something, typically wrapped in your own preconception of what that something is. That's precisely what Warren is doing, and thus her argument falls apart. Second of all, America is not a democracy. It's never been a democracy. Democracy is essentially a wide process of factionalism and majoritarian rule, which does not reflect the sober limits articulated and enshrined in the Constitution or, more broadly, in natural law. For a government to be just, it requires limits. For a people to be just, they require virtue. And if a people are allowed, and their appetites are allowed to interact with the political process, what happens? Factionalism happens. The passions overtake the mind. We're seeing this happen in the digital age more than any other age, where we see people having these absolute meltdowns over things which in the grand scheme of things have nothing to do with anything of any moral or ethical import, but have everything to do with how they have their compartmentalized view of the world has given the world to them. The passions are a danger, a threat to human reason. And if human beings cannot reason, we become indistinguishable from the brutes, from the animals. Thus, it is incumbent upon every human being who wishes to realize their moral and ethical powers, wishes to realize their rights, wishes to have a good society, to be able to reason. But Warren's statement, once again, does not reflect reason. It reflects blind adherence to abstraction. She has to establish that America is a democracy, which it is not. then she also has to establish that one man buying one platform on the internet is going to threaten society at large, especially when there are entire segments of society that are not even on the internet and that are vastly apolitical. Once again, Warren's argument falls flat. And one more point about the wealth tax. The wealth tax is essentially this tax that taxes someone's assets minus their debts. So not just their income, but their assets. Billionaires tend to have very high assets because they're billionaires, obviously. So they have a lot of assets. And so what Warren is saying here is that we need to control this wealth so these billionaires won't do these kind of things. But there's no indication, Elon Musk, who paid $11 billion in taxes, one of the highest taxpayers in the country, there's no indication that if you taxed him more, that would temper his resolve to fight for free speech. Once again, Warren misses the forest for the trees. She is philosophically dead in her critiques, and she is simply lashing out and making assertions which she cannot back up with any kind of reason rooted in logic, facts, or empirics. Number two, Robert Reich, he said this, and this is an argument others are using as well, that Elon's kind of freedom, he made this argument, Elon's freedom is freedom from accountability. Now, he made this argument in a Guardian article, and this argument has like 3 parts to it. So A, freedom of speech is based on wealth. So this is a quote from Reich. As a practical matter, your ability to be heard turns on the size of the microphone you can buy. Well, okay, so again, this is approximation ethics, proximity ethics. The fact that free speech today tends to have something to do with having a platform on the internet does not mean that's all that free speech is. This is incredibly reductive. Free speech is a natural faculty of the body. It's an extension of man's mind, his ability to reason, let out through the vehicle of his tongue, the vehicle of his words, which humans have been using to communicate for many, 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 many years. The fact that free speech has become associated with the internet does not mean that free speech is, in fact, the internet itself or a platform. Reich does not understand this very crucial philosophical distinction, which is why his entire use of free speech is definitionally and categorically incorrect in the first place. Just because you can amplify your voice by buying a digital platform does not mean that is the only way free speech works, or that is the best way free speech works, or that it can work no other way, or that is the basis of free speech. And yet Reich seems to disagree. Part B to this argument is that the free markets, because the argument is that Musk is here the free markets, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. The free markets aren't found in nature. That's Robert Reich's argument. The free markets are not found in nature. Well, that's also not true, because free markets are simply the spontaneous process of exchange of value, typically in the forms of communicable goods between one or more people, two or more people. That's what a free market system is. And of course, this is extrapolated from the micro level to the macro level, although it really only exists on the micro level. Ergo, you have different kinds of other kinds of systems and institutions tied to the free market. You have businesses, you have firms, all that kind of stuff, which are incidental to the principle of the free market. Free markets are absolutely found in nature because they are an extension of man's natural desire to live peaceably, as Hugo Rocha said in 1925, live peaceably with his fellow man, and one of the results of that natural inclination is trade. It is the exchange of goods and ideas between two people or more people, and that does result in the building of a society. And then Reich says that Twitter is the only platform of its kind, and essentially we should give it special consideration because of that. In fact, I will read it right here. He said, which brings us to free choice. If consumers don't like what Musk does with Twitter, they cannot simply switch to another Twitter-like platform. There aren't any. The largest social media platforms have grown gigantic because anyone who wants to participate in them and influence debate has to join them. After they reach a certain size, they're the only megaphone in town. Where else would consumers go to post short messages that can reach tens of millions of people other than Twitter? Once again, this is an argument, this is a fallacy from convenience. Just because something is convenient to you does not mean that it is a necessity for you to have. Just because Twitter is a convenient way to get your message out there does not mean that you have no choice if you cannot use Twitter, or you don't want to use Twitter, or you decide that you have gone somewhere else other than Twitter. Again, Reich is assuming that convenience equals, foundation. The foundation of free speech, the foundation of free choice, rather, which is part of his argument, it has nothing to do inherently with the internet. It has everything to do with man's ability to rationally decide what is best for him in accordance with his free will, in accordance with his reason, and then to pursue along with that. There is no one singular megaphone that everyone takes turns, taking up and screaming at. Rather, there are a series of different kinds of speaking devices, megaphones being one of them, but other things being other them, that people can use in many different ways to amplify their voices. Twitter happens to be the most convenient one, but that has nothing to do with the principle of free choice inherently. Let's move on. Senator Jeff Markley said that it's always a concern. This is his quote. It's always a concern when an oligarch might be owning the town square. I think we do need to pay a lot of attention to how it's managed, he said. Robert Reich also believes that Bezos and Musk owning a lot of the distributors of media, Bezos being Washington Post, Musk being Twitter now, is an example of an oligarchy. Okay, but there's a distinction here. So, an oligarchy is a rule from a few people. Okay. Now, for this to be an oligarchy, it cannot simply appear as an oligarchy. And this is why Reich and Markley's arguments are superficial. Because something can have the appearance, the aesthetic of an oligarchy without being a functional oligarchy. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are at each other's throats. Bezos basically accused Elon Musk after his acquisition of Twitter, of giving the Chinese a backdoor into Twitter. That is not an oligarchy. You cannot have an orderly government when there are people that are actively fighting against each other and have no common ground. The only thing that are similar between Bezos and Musk is that they are both billionaires, and to extrapolate from them both being billionaires, without actually even investigating the contents of their wealth or the kind of work they do, to extrapolate some kind of moral similarity between the two is to engage in A, proximity ethics and thus be lazy. You're doing lazy work, and B, also not to actually display any substantive difference, any substantive function of oligarchy between the two. It's all guilt by association. It's all proximity ethics, and the left ought to stop making these bad arguments, because I have to sit here and deal with them, and it makes me sick. I'm saying the same thing over and over and over again. Billionaires owning things is not an oligarchy. It is not a functional oligarchy, especially when those billionaires hate each other or have fundamentally different worldviews. Moving on. There's a bigger argument that Barack Obama made, I'll address in a longer video soon, that freedom of speech only applies to governments, not to Twitter. Or rather, the First Amendment only applies to governments, not to Twitter. Okay, the First Amendment is the statutory protection for a faculty that man has and always has had since he existed, and that is the faculty of the mind from which speech is produced. Freedom of speech is not simply about a law in a text somewhere. Freedom of speech is about our ability to grapple with the universe, to grapple with reality, with our mental faculties that are enshrined in every single one of us. Freedom of speech is a universal quality that every man has a grasp of. And the fact that rhetoricians like Obama cannot make this distinction or refuse to make this distinction just shows how conceptually foolish their arguments are. The First Amendment may not apply to Twitter, but freedom of speech being quite important to the perpetuation of the truth and human ideas most certainly does apply to Twitter, and it should apply in every case to any communication platform, even if that does not mean government intervention. It shouldn't mean that, but it should mean intervention of the mind to protect the sacred faculty that is ours. That is our freedom to speak. 5. Dick Durbin, senator from Illinois. He is concerned that Donald Trump will get back on Twitter, and that is dangerous for Americans, bad for Americans. And he is actually considering regulatory action to ensure that Twitter is doing content moderation. So the idea is that, okay, if Trump gets into Twitter, that's bad for Americans. Therefore, we need regulation. That's a stupid argument because, number one, this is guilt by association. If Trump were to get onto Twitter, that makes no substantive difference. You don't even know what he's going to say. That makes no substantive difference about the operations of Twitter. Number two, just because someone says something you do not like does not mean their speech is inherently dangerous. Or, well, it might be dangerous, but dangerous to your preconceptions, not dangerous to the physical being of people. And there's a deeper argument that permeates this idea. The idea of silence is violence, or certain kinds of speech or violence, words are violence rather. And the problem with this is that violence, when it's taken away from a physical context, is therefore subjective, and it's able to be applied in any way that someone wants it to be applied, and thus there is no consistent basis by which to understand it, and thus it does not function as a concept. Therefore, violence, if it is reinterpreted in this way, has no stable nucleus, has no definitional nucleus to it, and therefore is not a usable concept. It is incoherent. Number 6. Unmitigated free speech leads to real-world harm and hurts marginalized communities. This was the sentiment of Emerson Brooking from the Atlantic Council, which is a group that is a teetotaler for NATO, and I'll get to that later. And Emerson Brooking said, Musk's conception of free speech is people being able to express things that are odious, hateful, and even target harassment against other users. Again, this is a straw man. Musk never said that that's okay. Musk simply said that things that are offensive, or rather he's acting like things that are offensive, should not be grounds to restrict people's ability to express themselves. Rather, handle it in a way that does not require you to have an arbiter, a legislative arbiter, whether it be a Twitter one or whatever, to get involved. Twitter up until now has driven towards a different definition of free speech. The idea that by reducing harassment and overt hate, you create an opening for as many as voices as possible to express themselves. The problem is, what definitions of hate do you operate under? What definitions of harassment? I mean, harassment is pretty clear, but what about hate? A lot of people consider hate to be anything that disagrees with them. And if that's the definition of hate, and people on Twitter have that definition of hate, then how in the world can you expect that definition to lead to reasonable results? It cannot. It's an abstraction created in a faculty of subjective ideas, which is now being implemented on people with a bunch of different ideas. The common basis of free speech is an objective idea, an objective standard that people are able to govern themselves, they're able to use their faculties in a way that is responsible. And if they cannot, we have the ability to distance ourselves from them, or if they do so egregiously in the event of advocating for violence or advocating for rape or whatever, we can then enforce content on moderation and ban them, but only until when it gets to that point. If people are simply saying things that are of bad taste, that is not an objective reason to go after them. That is simply a reason that some people are using because they do not understand how to deal with that, independent of shutting it down. Life is a process. And if you shut down a process, you may very well reach the end result. All processes are not entirely comfortable. They're not supposed to be comfortable. I'm not saying people should be able to have to take abuse. No one should take abuse. But I also understand the block button exists for a reason, and I really also understand that my ability to freely associate people on social media and in the real world exists for a reason, and no one can take that away from me. No one has the right to take that away from me or you. So here's the question, my friends. I've listed a lot of arguments here. I hope I have gone through them faithfully and I've taken care of them faithfully. But it will all mean nothing if we forget one core truth. And that core truth is very simple and it's very paramount. Freedom of speech is not a law. It is a maxim enshrined in man's heart. It is necessary for as John Stuart Mill would say in On Liberty, the separation between truth and error. And then that's necessary for the perpetuation of the right kind of values and a good understanding of the world as the future goes on. These kind of arguments come from a low epistemic rung, meaning that they have no good basis in knowledge or no conceptual basis, no rigor to them. They are simply knee-jerk reactions that come from an ideology which apparently does not value speech that it determines to be harmful to the existence of people without actually considering what harm is, without actually considering why certain kinds of things are harmful to people, without actually considering what is the best way to deal with harmful speech, if you might call it that, without censoring the voices of people whose ideas are totally, if not legitimate, they totally have a right to be expressed. When we can recognize that, we will get much more further, but until we recognize that, this conversation will continue to operate on a low level. Think on it. My friends, I love you guys so much. If you love me, Patreon, please, my Patreon, please, patreon.com/officialcwatson, or my PayPal, officialcwatson@gmail.com, or please get me at my locals, which is going to be christianwatson.locals.com, or on my Discord, which is in the comment section down below. Please be sure to like, share, subscribe. This message is dynamite. Let's get out here as many people as possible. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.